So go ahead and send Ocasio-Cortez down there. Send Sandy, full send. And, let her deal with this. Let her be the diplomat in Venezuela. And she can see firsthand the socialist hellhole that she wants to bring to America. And where did we go in this country? So building a wall is immoral, but aborting your baby is a good thing. Being a billionaire is immoral, but aborting your baby is a good thing. Again, the crew is just rolling the B-roll sights and sounds from Venezuela. Awful situation down there. It's what happens in a socialist country. But, think about this. They're demonizing the fact that there's billionaires. And I'm just thinking, I understand the issues of income inequality. I understand the issues where you've got all these billionaires, but you've also got all these homeless people. But there's a principle there that nobody wants to talk about. And that's, you have to understand, a lot of these people are homeless and in dire straits because of their own choices. They would have ended up that way whether there's billionaires or not, whether they had different circumstances or not. Some people are there but from bad circumstances. I'm not saying it's all good. But the point is, demonizing billionaires and rich people that make money, that's the wrong attack method. Sure, there's income inequality. Sure, some of these billionaires probably are, not doing their fair share for society, but, they don't call them out. But it's in America, you're going to demonize billionaires. And you're going to say there shouldn't be billionaires allowed in America. What happened? Did we forget? That's part of the American dream. You can come here and be a billionaire. You can come here and be a king. Anyone can do it.
We economic hitmen really have been the ones responsible for creating this first truly global empire. And we work many different ways. But perhaps the most common is that we will identify a country that has resources our corporations covet, like oil, and then arrange a huge loan to that country from the World Bank or one of its sister organizations. But the money never actually goes to the country. Instead, it goes to our big corporations to build infrastructure projects in that country, power plants, industrial parks, ports, things that benefit a few rich people in that country, in addition to our corporations, but really don't help the majority of the people at all. However, those people, the whole country is left holding a huge debt. It's such a big debt they can't repay it, and that's part of the plan, that they can't repay it. And so at some point, we economic hitmen go back to them and say, listen, you owe us a lot of money, can't pay your debts, so sell your oil real cheap to our oil companies. Allow us to build a military base in your country, or send troops in support of ours to someplace in the world like Iraq, or vote with us on the next UN vote. To have their electric utility company privatized and their water and sewage system privatized and sold to U.S. corporations or other multinational corporations. So there was that whole mushrooming thing, and it's so typical of the way the IMF and the World Bank work, that you put a country in debt, it's such a big debt it can't pay it, and then you offer to refinance that debt and pay even more interest. And you demand this quid pro quo, which you call a conditionality or good governance, which means basically that they've got to sell off their resources, including many of their social services, their utility companies, their school systems sometimes, their penal systems, their insurance systems, to foreign corporations. So it's a double, triple, quadruple whammy.
Have we ever tried to meddle in other countries' elections?
Oh, probably, but it was for the good of the system in order to avoid the communists from taking over. For example, in Europe, in 47, 48, 49, the Greeks and the Italians, we
don't do that now, though? We don't mess around other people's elections, Joe?
Only for a very good cause.
Can you do that? Do a Vine video on a former CIA director.
Only for a very good cause in the interests of democracy.
All right, thanks for...
The precedent for economic hitmen really began back in the early 50s when democratically elected Mossadegh, who was elected in Iran, he was considered to be the hope for democracy in the Middle East and around the world. He was Time Magazine's Man of the Year. But one of the things that he'd run on and began to implement was the idea that foreign oil companies needed to pay the Iranian people a lot more for the oil that they were taking out of Iran. The Iranian people should benefit from their own oil. Strange policy.
According to some, it's about protecting civilians.
We must not tolerate this regime using military force against its own people.
Others say it's about oil.
The only reason they're interested with Libya is about the oil. You think we'd be in Iraq if the major export there was broccoli?
But some are convinced intervention in Libya is all about currency, specifically Gaddafi's plan to introduce the gold dinar, a single African currency made from gold, a true sharing of the wealth.
It's one of these things that you have to plan almost in secret, because as soon as you say you're going to change over from the dollar to something else, you're going to be targeted. There were two conferences on this, one in 96 and another one in the year 2000, called the World Mataba Conference, organized by Gaddafi. And everybody was interested. I think most countries in Africa were keen.
Gaddafi didn't give up. In the months leading up to the military intervention, he called on African and Muslim nations to join together to create this new currency that would rival the dollar and euro. They would sell oil and other resources around the world only for gold dinars. It's an idea that would shift the economic balance of the world. Countries' wealth would depend on how much gold they have, not how many dollars they trade. And Libya has 144 tons of gold. The UK has double that, but 10 times the population.
If Gaddafi had an intent to try to reprice his oil or whatever else the country was selling in the global markets and accept something else as a currency, or maybe launch a gold dinar currency, any move such as that would certainly not be welcomed by the power elite today who are responsible for controlling the world's central banks. So yes, that would certainly be something that would cause his immediate dismissal and the need for other reasons to be brought forth for removing him from power.
The UK's gold is kept here in a secure vault somewhere in the depths of the Bank of England. As in most developed countries, there's not enough to go around. But that's not the case in places like Libya and many of the Gulf states. A gold dinar would have given oil-rich African and Middle Eastern countries the power to turn around to their energy-hungry customers and say, sorry, the price has gone up and we want gold. Some say the US and its NATO allies literally couldn't afford to let that happen. Laura Emmett, RT, London.
We didn't like that, of course, but we were afraid to do what we normally were doing, which was to send in the military. Instead, we sent in one CIA agent, Kermit Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt's relative. And Kermit went in with a few $1 million and was very, very effective and efficient. And in a short amount of time, he managed to get Mossadegh overthrown and brought in the Shah of Iran to replace him, who always was favorable to oil. And it was extremely effective.
We met Abu Ahmad in Damascus a year ago. He and other activists smuggled us into Kafr Sousse to witness a demonstration. Even that simple act involved elaborate plotting.
More than 20 people, you put them around all the area and the neighborhood to watch if any police or species are coming.
Oh, how nice is freedom, the crowd chanted. Now those same streets are a battleground.
Did you think we would be here 1 year later?
I was thinking you will change the regime by the demonstration.
The demonstrations grew and multiplied, with Abu Ahmad always filming, believing his neighborhood would become the heart of the opposition in the capital. But at the end of February, he was detained, beaten so badly, he still doesn't know how he managed to survive. Abu Ahmad was released early last summer. He says most of those young men we had met at the protest had begun to take up arms, exchanging banners for battle.
It is interesting to me how this system has continued pretty much the same way for years and years and years, except the economic hitmen have got better and better and better. Then we come up with, very recently, what happened in Venezuela. In 1998, Hugo Chavez gets elected president, following a long line of presidents who had been very corrupt and basically destroyed the economy of the country. And Chavez was elected amidst all that. Chavez stood up to the United States. And he's done it primarily demanding that Venezuelan oil be used to help the Venezuelan people. Well, we didn't like that in the United States. So in 2002, a coup was staged, which there's no question in my mind, and most other people's minds, that the CIA was behind that coup. The way that that coup was fomented was very reflective of what Kermit Roosevelt had done in Iran, of paying people to go out into the streets, to riot, to protest, to say this Chavez is very unpopular. You know, if you can get a few thousand people to do that in television, and can make it look like it's the whole country, and things start to mushroom.
A crackdown in Syria. These are the suburbs of Deira, where protests flared last month. This unverified amateur video, say rights groups, with the army opening fire, is evidence of the latest bloodshed by forces loyal to the government. It's reported 8 tanks went into the old quarter, with the army shooting at random. Several bodies were seen lying near a mosque. It is a pattern repeated in other cities, say campaigners. In Douma, it's claimed scores of people have been arrested. This video was uploaded to social networking sites after an anti-government protest march allegedly in Damascus. A volley of gunfire is heard, whilst they are injured amongst the unarmed demonstrators. At least 100 people have been reported to have been killed since the start of the weekend, as protests continued despite President Bashar al-Assad ending the 48-year state of emergency. The campaign group Human Rights Watch called for a UN inquiry and international sanctions. In Nawa, at this funeral for protesters killed by security forces, thousands gathered to call for the overthrow of the president. Witnesses say 4 people were shot dead.
Iraq actually is a perfect example of the way the whole system works. So we economic hitmen are the first line of defense. We go in and we try to corrupt governments and get them to accept these huge loans, which we then use as leverage to basically own them. If we fail, as I failed in Panama with Omar Torrijos and in Ecuador with Jaime Roldos, men who refuse to be corrupted, then the second line of defense is we send in the jackals. And the jackals either overthrow governments or they assassinate. And once that happens and a new government comes in, and boy, it's going to toe the line because the new president knows what will happen if he doesn't. In the case of Iraq, both of those things failed. Economic hitmen were not able to get through to Saddam Hussein. We tried very hard. We tried to get him to accept a deal very similar to what the House of Saud had accepted in Saudi Arabia.
The indiscriminate bombing has prompted investigations by the UN for possible war crimes. But while the Saudis are leading this bloody campaign, the blame also spreads to a great power whose support is directly contributing to the carnage, to the United States. The US has supported Saudi Arabia militarily since World War II, selling arms, providing military aid, and training the Saudi military on how to use US-manufactured planes, tanks, and other weapons. In recent years, Saudi Arabia has bought more weapons from the US than any other country in the world. Just since March of 2015, the US has authorized $22 billion worth of weapon sales to Saudi Arabia. The most recent deal includes 20 Abrams tanks listed as battle damage replacements. The battle, of course, is Yemen. The weapons the US sells also include cluster bombs, banned by most of the international community, and F-15 fighter planes, which is making up the vast bulk of what the Saudi Air Force is currently using as it bombs Yemen. But America's aid to Saudi Arabia goes way beyond weapon sales, and it's directly contributing to the current fight. That's because Washington is literally helping to refuel Saudi planes while they strike targets across Yemen. When the Saudis asked the US to refuel one of their planes, giant American tankers like the KC-135 Stratotanker take off from the Incirlik Air Base in Turkey or from US carriers in the Arabian Sea. They then link up with Saudi F-15s in international airspace. These airborne refuels give the Saudi planes a much longer range and allow Saudi's air campaign to become more lethal because the planes can stay in the air longer and hit targets much more frequently. As of late November, the US had flown more than 1,600 refueling missions to over 6,300 aircraft in the skies bombing Yemen. That's an average of 2 a day.
But he wouldn't accept it. And so the jackals went in to take him out. They couldn't do it. His security was very good. After all, he had one time worked for the CIA. He'd been hired to assassinate a former president of Iraq and failed, but he knew the system. So in 91 we send in the troops and we take out the Iraqi military. So we assume at that point that Saddam Hussein is going to come around. We could have taken him out, of course, at that time, but we didn't want to. He's the kind of strong man we like. He controls his people. We thought he could control the Kurds and keep the Iranians in their border and keep pumping oil for us. And that once we took out his military, now he's going to come around. So the economic hitmen go back in the 90s without success. If they'd had success, he'd still be running the country. We'd be selling him all the fighter jets he wants and everything else he wants. But they couldn't, they didn't have success. The Jackals couldn't take him out again, so we sent the military in once again, and this time we did the complete job and took him out, and in the process created for ourselves some very, very lucrative construction deals. We had to reconstruct a country that we'd essentially destroyed, which is a pretty good deal if you own construction companies, big ones. So, you know, Iraq shows the three stages. The economic hitmen failed there, the Jackals failed there, and as a final measure, the military goes in. And in that way, we've really created an empire, but we've done it very, very subtly. It's clandestine. All the empires of the past were built on the military, and everybody knew they were building them. So the British knew they were building them, the French, the Germans, the Romans, the Greeks. And they were proud of it, and they always had some excuse like spreading civilization, spreading some religion, something like that. But they knew they were doing it. We don't. The majority of the people in the United States have no idea that we're living off the benefits of a clandestine empire, that today there's more slavery in the world than ever before. And then you have to ask yourself, well, if it's an empire, then who's the emperor? Obviously, our presidents of the United States are not emperors. An emperor is someone who's not elected, doesn't serve a limited term, and doesn't report to anyone, essentially. So you can't classify our presidents that way. But we do have what I consider to be the equivalent of the emperor, and it's what I call the corporatocracy. The corporatocracy is this group of individuals who run our biggest corporations, and they really act as the emperor of this empire. They control our media, either through direct ownership or advertising.
Just breaking this coming into us today, this video of people trying to get through, trying to make their way towards the border. Okay, so Mariara is in central Venezuela, and they need to get to the border towards Colombia in order to get the humanitarian aid, which means the medicine that many of these people need, and the food that so many of them need. And Nicolas Maduro has sent his military out to block them. Meanwhile, tonight, a major player in the Maduro regime is announcing his support for Juan Guaido, the opposition, and new elections. Most important here, he's willing to spill the beans and name some names, admitting that both Hugo Chavez and Nicolas Maduro courted drug traffickers, and alarmingly, Hezbollah.
They control most of our politicians because they finance their campaigns either through their corporations or through personal contributions that come out of the corporations.
It is time to officially recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel.
When President Trump made this announcement, one man likely smiling was Republican mega-donor Sheldon Adelson. The staunchly pro-Israel casino magnate gave $25 million to a political action committee supporting Trump, and $5 million to Trump's inauguration festivities.
They're not elected, they don't serve a limited term, they don't report to anybody. And at the very top of the corporatocracy, you really can't tell whether a person's working for a private corporation or the government because they're always moving back and forth. So, you know, you've got a guy who one moment is the president of a big construction company like Halliburton, and the next moment he's vice president of the United States, or the president who is in the oil business. And this is true whether you've got Democrats or Republicans in the office. You have them moving back and forth through the revolving door. And in a way, our government is invisible a lot of the time, and its policies are carried out by our corporations on one level or another. And then again, the policies of the government are basically forged by the corporatocracy and then presented to the government. They become government policy. So it's an incredibly cozy relationship.
So Aaron Matei caught this. He's reading McCabe's book, and which, boy, I got to tell you, Reading McCabe's book, huh? That's a real act of journalism to read that book, right? Because I ain't reading that book. Anyway, I probably should read that book because I bet there's lots of great stuff in it. But reading hurts dumb people's brains like me, and so I have to be selective on what I read. I can only take so much. But he was reading, Aaron Matei was reading his book, and on page 136 of his new book, he recounted a 2017 Oval Office meeting with Trump. And this is what this is. And this right here, do you want to know what this says? This is from his book. And what it says in his book, then the president talked about Venezuela. That's the country we should be going to war with, he said. They have all that oil, and they're right on our back door, he continued on, rambling and spitballing about whatever came to mind.